Hey guys, tonight we're floating back to medieval Europe, just drifting, not rushing, because the past isn't going anywhere. So go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pretend you're lying in a drafty stone chamber where someone definitely forgot to fix the window shutters. It's fine. It's atmospheric. Tonight's bedtime journey is called How Medieval Castles Maintained Their Walls and Moats, a Calm Day in History. And yes, that sounds like the most boring documentary your ninth grade history teacher ever put on. But trust me, medieval people were committed to maintenance. Like, ridiculously committed. You kind of have to be when your home is basically an overly aggressive pile of rocks pretending to be a building. So just settle in, take a slow breath, and let us drift into the world of castle upkeep, ka the medieval equivalent of having to clean your gutters every spring, except your gutters are a 30-foot defensive trench full of questionable water and probably an eel or two. We're starting simple. Stone walls. The stuff every 7-year-old draws when they picture a castle, usually with a dragon hovering nearby for a scale. Sadly, tonight we are leaving the dragon out. Way too exciting for bedtime. Let's begin. Imagine it's early morning in a medieval fortress. The sun is barely peeking over the horizon. A guard is standing up on the wall walk, trying very hard not to fall asleep. He's got that slow nod going, the one where your head dips forward and comes back up like a pigeon bobbing for seed. Medieval historians call this the I definitely shouldn't have stayed up drinking weak ale posture, but that's fine. Castle walls weren't just made for heroic battles and cinematic sieges. They were living, breathing structures, not literally breathing. That would be terrifying, but they were constantly shifting, cracking, eroding, crumbling, and otherwise misbehaving. Kind of like teenagers, but made out of limestone. So, let's talk about those walls. Castle walls were thick. Like, I skipped leg day for 10 years, thick. But even several meters of stone didn't magically stay in perfect shape. Every day, tiny things happened. Frost expanded cracks, rain washed away mortars, birds nested in crevices. And sometimes someone rammed a cart full of firewood into the outer wall because their depth perception was terrible. It happens. That's where the maintenance crew came in. Now, I know you're probably imagining medieval masons wearing leather aprons, solemnly chiseling away like artistic stone whisperers. And yes, sometimes they looked that noble, but most of the time, they probably looked like guys who'd been carrying heavy rocks since sunrise and smelled faintly of damp wool. Still, these people were the unsung heroes. Your castle stayed standing because of them. If medieval Yelp existed, they'd have 5 stars and several reviews that say things like, repaired wall quickly. Didn't judge me for accidentally causing the collapse. Every so often, usually once or twice a month. Sometimes more, if your castle was built on a cliff that nature actively wanted to reclaim. The Lord Steward would walk the perimeter with a small crew. They'd poke, prod, squint suspiciously, and argue about which crack was new and which had been there since King whoever's reign. You know how modern people say, "I think that crack in the ceiling is getting bigger." Medieval people said the exact same thing, except if they ignored it long enough, they might wake up one morning with a large portion of their wall missing. Because when a medieval wall fails, it doesn't politely sag. It explodes outward in a very dramatic, "Oops, we built this wrong" sort of way. So castle caretakers took cracks seriously. To keep walls in shape, masons used mortars. A lot of mortar. Think the pyramids, but wetter. Medieval mortar was made from lime, sand, water, and occasionally some delightfully weird additives, lard, beer, or ground-up plant fibers. Basically, anything sticky they could find. The result, kind of stone smoothie that, once dried, kept everything from falling apart. Over time, mortar eroded, especially in rainy climates, which, unfortunately, is all of Europe. So caretakers regularly did something called repointing, which is a fancy term for scraping out old, crumbly mortar and shoving new mortar into the gaps. It's like giving the castle Botox, except instead of smoothing wrinkles, you're trying to prevent structural collapse. Most castles needed repointing every few years, especially on the outer walls facing the weather. The sheltered inner courtyard walls usually lasted longer, unless some noble S-board child took a dagger to the mortar and carved their name into it. Kids haven't changed much, okay? Now let's float gently, gently down from the walls toward some moats were dry, some were full of water, and some were swampy, smelly, vaguely suspicious trenches that made you question medieval engineering choices. But one thing was true about all moats. Someone had to maintain them. In medieval times, having a moat was kind of like owning a fish tank. It looks cool, and it definitely impresses guests, but it also becomes a horrifying sludge pit unless you take care of it regularly. Let's start with water moats. These weren't sparkling crystal lakes full of elegant swans. They were stagnant, algae-filled, mosquito-infested ponds that liked to grow. Things, in the summer, they could get so thick with plant life that you'd swear you could walk across them. In winter, they froze just enough to trick people into thinking they could skate on them, which ended exactly how you think it did. So how did medieval people maintain these delightful cesspools? Well, step 1, don't let them completely dry out. No one wants enemy soldiers strolling right up to your walls like they on a pleasant morning walk. Step 2. Don't let them overflow, because then your castle courtyard becomes a surprise indoor pool, and your livestock becomes very confused. Moat caretakers, yes, that was an actual job, were responsible for managing the water flow. They adjusted gates, diverted streams, dug channels, and occasionally had to get into the moat itself to remove debris. Imagine wading into chest-deep mud while muttering about quitting your job and becoming a shepherd instead. Moats were basically medieval wildlife sanctuaries. Fish swam in them, frogs lived in them, and birds used them as hunting grounds. Sometimes the moat even ended up with eels, which medieval writers occasionally described as helpful, though it's not clear if the eels were assisting in defense or just vibing in mud. Some castles intentionally stocked their moats with fish. Food security, they said. But really, who wants to eat moat fish? It's like eating something that marinated in sadness. Still, the fish kept the water somewhat cleaner by eating larvae and plant matter. So the medieval thought process was, if it swims and eyes and tea, trying to kill us, let it stay. Not exactly a scientific strategy, but good enough. Over time, silt built up in the moat. Think of it like your kitchen sink accumulating gunk. Except this gunk could fill an entire trench the size of a football field. So every few years, the castle staff had to dredge it. This required shovels, buckets, ropes, questionable motivation, and an acceptance that your boots would never smell normal again. They'd scoop out mud, drag plants to the side, and pile everything into mounds that villagers later used as fertilizer. Because nothing says organic farming like soil mixed with centuries of moat goo. Now, not all moats were wet. Some were dry trenches lined with stakes, wooden obstacles, or just steep sides meant to trip up attackers' end. Honestly, these were much easier to maintain. But easier doesn't mean easy. Dry moats collected leaves, fallen branches, trash, dead animals, wind-blown hats, and the occasional drunk person who accidentally tumbled in. So caretakers walked the moat every week or so with rakes and carts, clearing debris to keep the slope visible and prevent erosion. Too much buildup, and the sides could collapse inward, turning your moat into a mildly disappointing ditch. Some lords even planted thorny bushes along dry moats. Because if someone's trying to invade, why not make them suffer botanically first? Let's drift back up to the walls. Now not the stone part, but the top, the battlements. You know, the little alternating up and down pattern kids always draw when they sketch a castle. Those gaps are called crenels, and the raised bits are called merlins. I know the words sound like characters from a fantasy novel, but maintaining battlements was a full-time job. A lot of castles used wooden structures on top of their walls, hoardings, walkways, guard posts, and wood, as you know, loves to rot. It also loves to be eaten by insects, warped by rain, and set on fire by careless kitchen servants. So the castle carpenters were constantly repairing and replacing wood. Hoardings, those wooden balconies that stuck out over the wall, were especially high maintenance. They let defenders drop rocks or boiling water on attackers, but they also caught wind like a poorly designed sail. After a good storm, half the hoardings might need repairs. Medieval lords definitely sighed a lot. Wall walks sometimes had roofs. Sometimes they didn't. When they did, the roofs were usually tile or wooden shingles. Oh boy. They fell off constantly. A storm. Shingles gone. High wind. Shingles gone. A bird sneezed. Probably still gone. So carpenters regularly replaced damaged tiles, patched leaks, and secured loose boards. And while this sounds simple, imagine doing it while standing on a narrow walkway 40 feet in the air during a time when safety rails were not a concept. Medieval carpenters were basically the chillest adrenaline junkies. Now, let's drift to something really cozy. Medieval castle gutters, ka. Now, these weren't sleek aluminum gutters. These were long troughs carved into stone or built from lead sheets. And since castles were often surrounded by trees, they filled with leaves every fall. Leaves clogged gutters. Clogged gutters overflow. Overflowing water drips down walls. Walls become damp. Damp walls crumble. Crumbled walls make lords very unhappy. So every few weeks, someone had to climb up and scoop out piles of soggy leaves, twigs, feathers, and whatever else nature dumped in there. The job description was something like, wanted, gutter cleaner, must be fearless, balanced, and not overly bothered by filth. No surprise, this job usually went to the youngest apprentice or the most unfortunate servant. Re-drifting now to the towers, the big circular or square structures that served as both lookout points and bragging rights. The bigger your towers, the more you were saying, "Look how rich and defensive I am." Towers had multiple floors, staircases, wooden beams, and roofs. And each of those parts needed care. Spiral staircases especially wore down over time. Thousands of feet trudging up and down made the center posts wobble and the steps sag. Sometimes a step cracked entirely, leaving a suspicious gap that everyone pretended not to see. Masons patched these steps with stone wedges or mortar. Carpenters replaced wooden stairs when they rotted. And when the staircase was too far gone, they rebuilt the whole thing, which was a project. Towers leaked constantly. The roofs weren't always steep enough. The tiles shifted, and waterproofing wasn't exactly modern grade. So every winter, Tower floors grew damp patches, and people blamed everything from poor craftsmanship to evil spirits. Spoiler, it was always poor craftsmanship. Here's the truth. Medieval castles were always under repair. Always. There was no year when everything worked perfectly. Something was always cracking, sinking, leaking, breaking, or mysteriously falling off. And yet, through constant, slow maintenance carried out by dozens of hard-working masons, carpenters, ditch cleaners, and endlessly tired servants, these structures survived for centuries. So next time you see a picture of a beautiful medieval castle, just remember, behind that picture were hundreds of people patching, scrubbing, dredging, hauling, and reinforcing day after day. Kind of makes your weekly chore list feel short, doesn't it? Thanks for joining me on this calm journey. Until next time, sleep well.
Welcome back. Let's keep gliding through this medieval maintenance day. You don't have to get up. You don't even have to open your eyes. Just imagine the gentle sound of distant church bells, the clinking of tools, and someone quietly complaining about how many stones they still have to carry before lunch. We're floating downward now, into the inner courtyard of the castle. This is where half the daily chaos lived. Servants sweeping, cooks shouting, livestock wandering around like they owned the place, and artisans fixing whatever broke overnight. The walls and moat were only the beginning. A castle was basically a small village trapped inside a giant stone exoskeleton, and everything in that little village needed maintenance too. Now don't worry. We're not going to run. We're not even going to stroll. We're going to drift, like an exhausted medieval ghost that can't be bothered to haunt anyone properly. Let's ease into the courtyard upkeep. Sweepers, shovelers, and the eternal battle against mud. If you lived in a medieval castle, there were two universal truths. The floors were always uneven. Everything eventually turned into mud. Rain, mud. Spilled water, mud. Livestock walking through, mud. Someone dropping a bucket of soup, you guessed it, mud with seasoning. So courtyard maintenance crews spent a ridiculous amount of time shoveling, sweeping, raking, and scraping. Stone pavements existed in some castles, sure, but most courtyards were packed earth. Packed earth that rain lovingly redistributed every week. Servants carried bundles of straw to lay down on soggy patches. They smoothed dirt with wide wooden scrapers. They dug drainage grooves to keep puddles from becoming miniature lakes. Basically, medieval people invented the first extremely low-budget landscaping service. And because medieval Europe loved rain, like it was a personality trait, the entire process repeated itself constantly. Day after day, week after week, eternity after eternity. If reincarnation is real, most medieval sweepers probably came back as Roombas, with piles that needed micromanaging. Castles ran on fire. Heat, cooking, blacksmithing, brewing, everything required flames, which meant wood, and lots of it. But wood piles are drama. They're out when stacked wrong. They attract insects. They grow mold faster than medieval cheese. They collapse into messy heaps if someone sneezes too hard. So the steward appointed a woodmaster, essentially the medieval version of a warehouse manager with worse lighting. This person supervised where wood was stacked, how it was rotated, which pieces were dry enough to burn, which were secretly harboring questionable fungus, and which logs had mysteriously disappeared because some servant stole them for personal heating. Wood piles also required covering. Cloth sheets, thatched lean-tos, or crude roofing kept rain off the logs. Because wet firewood is the historical equivalent of trying to toast marshmallows over a damp sock. Every few weeks, the entire pile was reorganized. Imagine the biggest game of Jenga, except the losing condition is everyone freezes to death. Repairing wooden walkways and gallery floors. Many castles had long wooden galleries, upper floor passages, where nobles pretended to be important while servants scurried underneath. These galleries creaked. A lot. Medieval carpenters regularly checked the floorboards, tapping them with mallets like skeptical inspectors. When a board sounded hollow or gave too much under pressure, they marked it with chalk. Later, they ripped it out and replaced it with a new plank cut in the castle workshop. This whole operation was quieter than fixing the battlements, but just barely. You could always tell when carpenters were working because the entire hallway sounded like a polite but persistent drum circle. Some boards warped in damp weather, some shrank in dry seasons, and sometimes a noble with expensive shoes stomped too hard and cracked a board, then pretended it had always been like that. Castle staff develop a unique skill set, identifying which wooden creaks were normal and which meant someone is about to fall through the floor. It was an art, the smithy, where metal was constantly rebelling. Castles needed metalwork for everything: hinges, locks, nails, horseshoes, window bars, gate chains, armor repairs, cooking hooks, more nails, and even more nails. Seriously, medieval structures were held together by nails the way modern life is held together by caffeine. Blacksmiths were essential, and their workshop was always hot, loud, and covered in soot. But the smithy also had its own maintenance rituals. The forge needed clearing, the bellows needed repairing, the tools needed sharpening, cooling troughs needed refilling, and the entire workspace had to be swept regularly because bits of metal scrap tended to multiply like chaotic metallic rabbits. And of course, the castle's main gate, its enormous wooden and iron security blanket, was basically a high-maintenance diva. Hinges seized up, metal bolts rusted, iron bands loosened, wooden doors warped from humidity. Every creak and groan had to be investigated, because nobody wanted to be the castle that couldn't close its own gate during an emergency. Gate maintenance alone could take hours. A well-oiled castle gate was a thing of beauty. A neglected one sounded like a medieval wail crying for help. The drawbridge, wobbling into the spotlight. Let's drift to something iconic now, the drawbridge. This was the castle's equivalent of a front porch combined with a garage door. And like all garage doors, it broke at the worst possible times. Drawbridges operated with thick wooden planks, heavy iron chains, pulley wheels, counterweights, and the collective hope that everything stayed in sync. Maintaining the drawbridge required constant attention. Chains rust, replace links, counterweight ropes fray, rewind and tighten, pulley wheels squeak, add more grease, bridge tilts unevenly, adjust the supports before someone ends up in the moat. The men working the winches usually did so with slow, steady pulling motions, perfect for falling asleep to. It's rhythmic, like a medieval ASMR. Creak, clank, pause, sigh. If the drawbridge ever jammed halfway, workers climbed into the mechanism room, full of ropes, gears, and medieval dust bunnies, to unstick it. That room was basically a medieval escape room, except nobody enjoyed being in it. The Great Hall, fixing the social center. Every castle had a great hall, where everyone gathered to eat, gossip, exaggerate hunting stories, complain about the weather, and pretend they didn't see rats running across the floorboards. Maintenance here was a daily affair. Floor scraping. Great hall floors were often layered with rushes, long plants spread across the ground to absorb dirt and smells. These rushes needed replacing regularly. This process was known as scraping the hall, and it involved pulling out old rushes, now full of crumbs, feathers, and regret, scraping the floor with long-handled tools, spreading new rushes mixed with herbs like lavender or mint, basically medieval aromatherapy, except the smells were fighting an uphill battle. Tapestries, beautiful but high maintenance. Tapestries were insulation before insulation existed, but they collected dust faster than a medieval library. Every season, they were taken down, beaten with sticks, and rehung. Imagine being the servant assigned to tapestry beating duty. You're out in the courtyard, whacking an enormous woven artwork while wishing you'd chosen a different career path. Still, these tapestries kept halls warmer, hid cracks, and muffled echoes. So the beating continued. Smoke, soot, and ceiling trouble. Great halls had giant fireplaces. Giant fireplaces created giant amounts of soot. Soot clung to beams, drifted into rafters, and slowly stained everything black. Sometimes it turned wooden ceilings brittle. So workers periodically climbed up with brushes, scrapers, and ladders to remove centuries of fireplace enthusiasm. It was dangerous. Such showers were an occupational hazard, but necessary. If someone forgot this chore, the next big feast could become incredibly dramatic when smoke suddenly refused to leave the hall and instead filled it like a medieval fog machine. The water system, medieval plumbing, sort of. Castles didn't have modern plumbing, but they had water systems. And oh, did these systems need maintenance? Wells. Most castles had deep wells carved straight into bedrock. These wells needed regular cleaning, silt removal, bucket repair, rope inspection. The rope especially, if it frayed, someone's water bucket or hand was going straight into the abyss. Rainwater tanks. Some castles collected rainwater in cisterns. But rainwater brings leaves, dirt, bird feathers, and random airborne mysteries. Cisterns filled with sludge, unless cleaned out by brave individuals willing to climb inside with a bucket and a very bad attitude. Aqueduct pipes. In some fancy castles, lead pipes brought water from springs. But lead pipes clog. They warp. They leak. They poison you. Honestly, lead pipes are not history's finest invention. Maintenance meant opening access panels and poking long rods through the pipes until the blockages gave up. Imagine medieval drain clearing. Satisfying, but not glamorous. Latrines, the quietest disaster zones. Let's drift slowly, gently, pretending we can't smell anything, toward the latrines. Castle latrines, also called garderobes, were essentially stone closets built into the outer walls, with a vertical shaft that dumped into the moat, a cesspit, or the abyss of we don't talk about that corner of the castle. Even though these were gravity-powered, nature still found ways to complicate everything. The shaft blockage. Sometimes the chute clogged with waste, straw, cloth, or whatever someone dropped by accident, or on purpose. When this happened, the castle staff called in unfortunate laborers armed with poles, buckets, and absolutely no sense of smell left. Cesspit overflow. Cesspits filled up. And no, they didn't magically empty themselves. Workers shoveled out the contents and hauled them away to fertilize fields. Yes, medieval agriculture was efficient. Yes, that efficiency came at a psychological cost. Latrine maintenance was so notorious that some castle blueprints placed garderobes directly over fast-running streams. A self-cleaning toilet of sorts, assuming you're okay with the local wildlife receiving regular nutrient gifts. Animals, constantly undermining maintenance efforts. Animals lived everywhere in castles. Horses, pigs, goats, chickens, dogs, cats, the occasional rogue goose with violent personal opinions. And each animal contributed to the maintenance to-do list. Horses chewed with beams. Pigs dug holes. Goats climbed onto things they shouldn't. Chickens pooped enthusiastically. Cats knocked over storage jars just because. Stable boys and animal keepers were always repairing fences, sweeping straw, patching feeding troughs, and trying to keep creatures where they belonged. It never worked perfectly. Geese in particular were the worst. Medieval geese were basically living alarm systems with the emotional stability of a thunderstorm. They bit soldiers, chased noble women, and bullied dogs. And when a goose damaged something, everyone pretended they didn't see it. Safer that way. Vegetation control. The castle versus nature. Stone walls are strong, but plants are patient. Ivy climbed everything. Moss grew on every shaded surface. Tree roots crept under foundations. Grass sprouted between stones. So gardeners, yes, castles had gardeners, spent most of their time fighting nature's attempt to reclaim the property. They cut vines. They trimmed branches. They weeded stairways. They removed shrubs growing suspiciously close to walls. Floating through the courtyard, you'd often hear a gardener muttering about ivy being the devil's beard. The soundscape of daily repairs. If you stood in a medieval castle courtyard all day, you'd hear hammers tapping, chisels scraping, water sloshing, buckets clanking, servants sighing, carpenters arguing about wood grain, roosters crowing off schedule, drawbridge chains clinking, and distant dogs who seemed upset at absolutely nothing. It wasn't chaotic, it was just constant. A gentle background hum of maintenance, repeating forever like a sleepy historical soundtrack. This was castle life. Not glamorous, not dramatic, just steady, quiet, endless, and surprisingly cozy. Once you got used to the sound of 5 different repairs happening at the same time. Welcome back. Let's drift again, softly, slowly, past the inner courtyard, through the archway that leads into the outer bailey. This was the castle's working district, its industrial zone, its we store all the ugly but important stuff here area. Not glamorous, but crucial, and unsurprisingly, bursting with maintenance tasks. No rushing allowed. Just keep floating, like a medieval cloud that got bored and decided to study castle logistics. The outer wall, big, moody, and needy. The outer bailey was usually surrounded by its own wall, a kind of introverted cousin to the grand inner wall. And though it didn't get as much attention, it required just as much maintenance. Maybe more. Why? Because attackers always targeted it first, and Mother Nature targeted it second. Cracks formed. Stone shifted. Sections slumped after heavy rain. The outer wall was like a medieval middle child, responsible for everything, appreciated by no one. Stone slippage. Outer walls were built on soil rather than bedrock. Soil moves. It expands in wet seasons and shrinks in dry ones. This made stones tilt, slide, and occasionally wander away like medieval escape artists. Stonemasons spent countless hours resetting loose stones, repacking soil, and muttering about idiots who built this thing too close to the bog. Which, to be fair, happened more often than you'd think. Weathering and water damage. Rain eroded mortar. Frost expanded cracks. Wind whipped against the battlements. Birds nested in the stonework and contributed, let's say, organic complications. Workers climbed ladders and scaffolding, chiseling out damaged stone, tapping new blocks into place, and brushing fresh mortar along the joints. The rhythm was slow and hypnotic. Chip, chip, scrape, tap, tap. Perfect background noise for a sleepy medieval afternoon. Workshops, medieval chaos factories. The outer bailey housed most of the castle's workshops. Carpenters, coopers, fletchers, arrow makers, potters, wheelwrights, leatherworkers, and occasionally, people who just yelled because something broke again. And every workshop had its own maintenance rituals. The carpenter's yard. Planks everywhere. Sawdust drifting like medieval snow. Half-finished beams leaning on walls. Tools spread across benches. And carpenters walking around with the confident exhaustion of people who spent their entire lives repairing things other people broke. They sharpened saws on grinding stones. Oiled planes so they didn't seize up. Filed chisels until they gleamed. And replaced tool handles, because medieval workers managed to break handles at a supernatural rate. Then they'd stack their timber neatly along the outer wall, so it could dry properly. Theoretically. In practice, rainstorms, livestock, and small children constantly ruined the timber stacks, and carpenters had to reorganize them weekly. The Fletcher's space. Arrow makers had delicate tasks. Their workspace needed to be kept dry and wind-free. Any draft could ruin fletching alignment. So maintaining their workshop meant patching wall gaps, oiling shutters, and inspecting shelves for moisture. Fletchers were surprisingly picky. They'd complain if a single feather got damp. And fair enough. Nobody wants arrows that wiggle mid-flight like confused ducks. The pottery area. Potters spent half their time spinning clay, half their time firing pots, and half their time fixing things that broke. Yes, that's 3 halves. Potters never rested. Their kiln needed constant attention. Cracks formed in the oven walls. Heat escaped. Tiles loosened. Ash clogged vents. So potters regularly replastered their kilns, a process involving mud, straw, and way too much patience. The kiln walls were warm and earthy, almost soothing, if you ignored the occasional blast of smoke. Pottery tools required maintenance too. Scrapers dulled. Wheels squeaked. And glazing bowls developed chips that needed smoothing. All of it slow, repetitive, grounding, almost meditative, if you forget that the whole space smelled faintly like warm clay and desperation. Storage buildings. The kingdom of please don't let this spoil. Castle stored everything: grain, tools, weapons, fodder, salted meat, wine, ale, firewood, cart parts, rope, hay, salted fish, and the general anxiety of knowing that winter might be harsh. Storage buildings required constant inspection. Grain barns. Grain attracted mice, rats, weevils, damp, mold, and occasionally a cat who decided it lived there now. To prevent spoilage, workers swept floors, checked roof tiles, sealed cracks in the walls, turned the grain to keep moisture from settling, aired out sacks, patched holes chewed by rodents, yelled at rodents, yelled at cats for ignoring rodents, and yelled at each other for everything else. Grain was survival. If grain spoils, winter becomes a Hunger Games reboot. So this maintenance was serious, even if everyone involved was sleepy and cranky. Fodder sheds. Hay needed regular fluffing. Yes, medieval people officially fluffed hay. Flattened hay molded. Mold killed animals. Dead animals made nights ride slower, and nobody wanted that. So stable hands forked hay into airy piles, checked for damp spots, and repositioned bales so they didn't lean against cold stone walls. Hay sheds were basically medieval fire hazards waiting to happen. So they also kept buckets of water nearby and banned open flames, unless someone ignored the rules to smoke a pipe, which happened with alarming frequency. Weapon stores. Swords rust. Armor rusts. Crossbows warp. Arrows need replacing. Spears shed splinters. So the castle had armorers who spent entire days sanding rust, oiling blades, and tightening fittings. They worked with slow, repetitive motions, half polishing, half meditating. If you walked by the armory, you'd hear SHRRK, 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 the sound of whetstone on steel. Soft, persistent, almost hypnotic. The stables, the smelliest part of the castle, and the most important. The stables were vital. Horses were medieval Teslas, expensive, admired, and always in need of expert care. Stable maintenance was non-stop, mucking out stalls, repairing loose boards, trimming ropes and reins, checking for dry rot, sweeping straw, fixing trough leaks, mending saddle racks, oiling tack, shoeing flies, attempting to reason with horses who had no interest in being reasonable. Stable floors needed constant scraping with flat wooden shovels. Urine soaked into the packed earth. Manure piled up. Flies bred at the speed of gossip. So stable boys worked in cycles. Clean, sweep, replace straw, repeat. Horseshoe marks were another problem. Horses gnawed on beams like bored toddlers. So carpenters regularly sanded down-chewed surfaces and hammered iron plating over the worst spots. If a stable roof leaked, game over. Horses hate cold drips as much as humans do. So even minor leaks triggered full roof inspections, complete with ladders, tiles, and very tired workers. The castle kitchens, organized, chaotic, and always breaking. Castle kitchens were the loudest place in the fortress. Pots boiling, meat roasting, people shouting recipes that definitely weren't written down anywhere. Dogs circling the floor like furry vultures. And maintenance. Constant. Ovens and hearths. Cooking hearths cracked from heat stress. Ovens warped. Brick linings crumbled. Ash built up. Soot clogged flues. So the cooks and kitchen workers spent every morning clearing ashes, sweeping soot, and patching tiny cracks with clay. A good kitchen hearth was a prized possession. A bad hearth filled the room with smoke until everyone's eyes watered and the head cook threatened to quit for the 7th time that week. Kitchen tools. Pots dented, skillets warped, knives dulled, ladles somehow disappeared, possibly into another dimension. So blacksmiths repaired cookware almost daily. Knives, especially, needed constant sharpening. A dull knife was a disgrace. Also dangerous. Also annoying. Kitchen workers wiped tools, rinsed them in buckets, hung them on hooks, and pretended the kitchen wasn't slowly wearing itself down like the deck of a ship. Water stations. Kitchen wells and buckets needed cleaning too. Anything that touched food required attention. They scrubbed wood until it splintered, then replaced the buckets with new ones from the cooper. Even the chopping blocks needed maintenance, shaving down grooves, smoothing surfaces, wiping off the ghosts of vegetables past. The Bailey Gatehouse, a drama magnet. The gatehouse connecting the outer Bailey to the outside world was one giant maintenance puzzle. It had giant doors, iron reinforcements, a portcullis, murder holes, arrow slits, winding stairs, guardrooms, and about 14,000 places something could break. Portcullis troubles. Portcullises were heavy. Like this is how we killed gym memberships heavy. They ran on grooves carved into the walls, lifted by rope and weight mechanisms that needed daily inspection. Grooves clogged with dirt, ropes frayed, counterweights jammed, pulleys squeaked. Sometimes the portcullis got stuck halfway, and everyone pretended it wasn't embarrassing. Cleaning the grooves meant sending a servant up with brushes and rags and instructing them not to think too hard about the fact that they were surrounded by giant iron teeth. Guardroom repairs. Guards leaned on things constantly. Benches broke, tables cracked, door latches failed, weapons racks sagged. The guardrooms were essentially medieval break rooms, except everything in them suffered from chronic overuse and underappreciation. Carpenters and blacksmiths visited weekly with toolkits, tightening hinges, smoothing splinters, and fixing whatever the guard swore was already like that. Livestock pens. Medieval maintenance in its purest form. Beyond the workshops and storage huts, many castles kept additional livestock. Pigs, sheep, cows, chickens, maybe a donkey with a questionable attitude. Their pens required constant rebuilding. Wooden fences bent, posts rotted, roofs sagged. Animals escaped. Animals broke things. Animals staged tiny rebellions. The shepherds and herdsmen spent half their time repairing fences, the other half chasing animals that had knocked those fences down. Some pens had stone foundations, but even stone shifted over time, especially when a determined pig decided to dig a tunnel under it. Well houses and water lifts. Castles that relied on deep wells often protected them with well houses, small stone huts with wooden roofs. And these structures needed regular checks for leaking roofs, weakened timbers, fraying bucket ropes, algae buildup, crank handle wear and tear. Water lifting was hard work. Crank handles splintered, bucket rims wore out, and the entire system creaked like an elderly wizard standing up from a chair. Workers oiled the handles, replaced ropes, and scrubbed algae from the stone. They did this because water was life, and because the alternative was dying of thirst 3 weeks before spring. The perimeter path. Walking the loop. Every day, someone, usually the steward, accompanied by a few unfortunate assistants, walked the entire perimeter of the outer Bailey. This was a ritual, a slow meditation disguised as a maintenance check. They looked for fallen stones, loose planks, shifted soil, broken drainage channels, leaning posts, eroded pathways, signs of animal burrowing, suspicious damp patches, and anything else that whispered, "Fix me before I become a real problem." This loop took hours, but it was calming in its own way. The steady pace, the crunch of gravel, the soft scrape of boots, the quiet muttering of the steward cataloging new chores. It was the medieval equivalent of checking every room in your house before bed, but scaled up to the size of a fortified village. A final drift across the outer Bailey. As we float across the space one last time, picture the slow choreography of maintenance. A stable boy sweeping straw, a carpenter tapping a plank into place, a potter smoothing kiln walls, a guard oiling his sword, a cook scraping soot from a hearth, a servant hauling buckets of water, a mason checking cracks in the wall, a cat overseeing everything with smug disinterest. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't dramatic. But it was steady, rhythmic, predictable, and essential. Every day in a medieval castle was a gentle hum of repetitive tasks, quiet, methodical, almost sleepy in its constancy. It kept everyone alive. It kept the castle standing, and it gave medieval life its slow, grounded pace. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake at this point, congratulations. And if you're barely hanging on, even better. That is exactly the energy we're going for tonight. Let's drift gently back into the slow, damp world of medieval wall maintenance. Because nothing says relaxation like algae problems and masonry fatigue. So moats. They look dramatic in movies, but in reality, they were basically oversized ditches with commitment issues. Medieval moats loved causing problems. If a moat wasn't turning into a glorified swamp, it was slowly eroding the very walls it was supposed to protect, which is honestly on brand for medieval infrastructure. And so, naturally, people had to maintain the moat itself, which, again, protected the wall, which also needed maintenance because of the moat. A beautiful cycle. Very circular. Very watery. Let's float back to that scene. Imagine a quiet dawn. The castle isn't under attack, which is lucky because the moat crew is already out there, half awake, poking the water with long sticks to test the depth. They're checking for silt buildup, their enemy. Silt was basically medieval plaque. And like plaque, if you ignored it, it slowly suffocated everything. Now, because medieval people loved making things harder than they needed to be, moat maintenance wasn't just scoop out mud. It was more like, Step 1. Pray the bottom isn't hiding a long-forgotten wagon. Step 2. Find volunteers. Or, realistically, assign volunteers forcibly. Step 3. Try not to fall in and become part of the silt. This routine happened constantly, especially in wet climates where moats acted like giant rain collectors. Every storm, more mud. Every spring, more plant growth. Every summer, algae blooming like it paid rent. And after all that shoveling, the moat still smelled like disappointment. But keeping it functional mattered. A deep, clear moat discouraged bold attackers. A shallow, muddy moat encouraged them, or worse, didn't slow them down enough. So they just fell in halfway, became angry, and then redoubled their efforts. No one wanted that. So yes, medieval castles maintained their moats with the same stubborn persistence that we use to maintain Wi-Fi connections today. Not pretty, but necessary. Now, let's hover closer to the walls again, shifting from wet, murky problems to stone ones. Walls had personalities. Some were dependable. Some crumbled at the slightest provocation. And some insisted on growing moss like a fashion choice. Moss looked charming from a distance. Up close, it was like nature's passive-aggressive reminder that moisture was slowly working its way into the stone. And any time moisture got into stone, the stone eventually said, "I'm tired," and cracked. So how did they handle that? Scraping. Endless scraping. Quiet, rhythmic, slightly depressing scraping. Not the violent scraping you're imagining. More like a soft brushing paired with muttering about how the wall is doing this again, even though it's only been 3 months. Sometimes they use stiff brushes. Sometimes specialized trowels. Sometimes, and this is absolutely true, they just sent a kid up there with a short stick and optimism. Because repairing stone wasn't cheap, but children were. And let's not forget ivy. Ivy is lovely in modern castle photos, but medieval masons hated the stuff. Ivy roots dig deep, wedge deeper, and eventually start pulling the wall apart, like the world's slowest catastrophic breakup. Removing ivy, though, required patience. Pull too fast, and you rip out mortar with it. Pull too slow, and the ivy thinks you're playing a game, so it grows back even stronger. Maintaining walls was not a glamorous job. It was slow, and repetitive, and strangely calming, if you weren't the one doing it. Now let's glide to the next sleepy detail, the wall-top walkway, where guards marched back and forth, counting how many hours until lunch. This walkway needed constant attention to. Rain soaked the wood. Snow crushed it. Birds contributed to the problem. Let's leave it at that. So while the guards gazed out pretending to be vigilant, behind them were workers checking every board, tapping lightly with little wooden mallets to see if the sound felt off. This was the medieval version of diagnostics. If it sounded hollow, replace it. If it sounded soft, replace it. If it sounded like the board was too wet, replace it. If it sounded normal but the worker didn't trust it, replace it anyway. Again, repetitive. Again, meditative. Again, perfect bedtime material. One more quiet problem, pigeons. Pigeons truly believed every castle wall belonged to them. They nested. They perched. They occasionally died in awkward places, which then created smells no one wanted to deal with. Cleaning droppings off high stonework wasn't glamorous, but someone did it. A board apprentice. a guy doing penance for minor crimes, or a servant who drew the short straw that morning. Throughout all this, castle life moved slowly. Walls were scraped, moats were dredged, wooden stairs were repaired, creaking drawbridges were oiled, and nobody thought these tasks were exciting, which makes them exactly perfect for a late-night story. Let's drift a little deeper into the quiet side of maintenance, because while the big tasks were important, countless tiny ones kept a castle feeling alive. There were drainage channels carved into stone that needed clearing. There were gutters that collected debris like overachievers. There were hinges to oil on those massive iron doors that weighed more than a horse. And each hinge had a different personality. Some behaved. Some squeaked like they were auditioning for a horror play. Some refused to move until 3 grown men pushed at once. You'd think aristocrats cared about this. They did not. They mostly cared that things didn't sound annoying while they walked past. And since medieval aristocrats were world-class complainers, servants made sure everything stayed quiet. Quiet hallways, quiet gates, quiet courtyards, quiet moats even. And outside, along the walls, workers continued their peaceful, never-ending dance with erosion. Slow, steady, methodical, just like we want tonight. But there's still more to explore. Because castles weren't static. They changed over generations. New walls were added. Old walls were reinforced. Towers leaned a little and had to be straightened, politely, with a lot of labor. Every modification created a new maintenance problem. And since we're settling in for the long haul, and since the night is calm, let's drift on to the next quiet corner of medieval castle upkeep. Hey guys, welcome back. Settle in. Adjust the pillow. Maybe stretch your toes a little. We're drifting again into the pleasantly uneventful world of castle upkeep, the kind of topic that feels like a warm cup of something at midnight. So let's just ease right back into it. Tonight, we're gliding over to a part of the castle that rarely gets attention in movies because, of course, filmmakers enjoy excitement. And we're doing the opposite. Let's talk about cracks. Cracks in walls. Cracks in towers. Cracks in staircases that really shouldn't have cracked because they were built last decade. But here we are. Medieval builders understood one simple truth. Stone moves. Not dramatically, just with the subtle confidence of something that knows it weighs several tons. Temperature changes made it expand. Cold made it contract. Moisture seeped in, froze, thawed, and acted like nature's passive-aggressive jackhammer. So masons walked around the castle like medieval dentists checking for cavities. They tapped stones lightly with little hammers and listened. If the sound echoed wrong, there was a gap behind it. If the sound was too dull, there was moisture. If the sound was normal, they still made a note to check it again next week, just in case. There was nothing fast about this process. Each check was slow, intentional, calm, exactly the pace we're looking for. And the fixes? Oh, they were even slower. Let's float up onto a quiet tower where a mason is repairing a small crack. He's mixing mortar, which, in the Middle Ages, took roughly the same amount of patience required to watch dough rise. He stirs, waits, adds water, waits again, murmurs to himself about the weather, finally applies a little dab onto the crack. This tiny patch might prevent a large break later, or it might fall out next spring when the moisture shifts again. Who knows? Castle maintenance is essentially medieval guesswork, supported by centuries of tradition and at least 3 generations of complaining. Now, let's drift to another area, the castle gates. The main gate was, technically, the castle's front door. And just like a modern front door, it made weird noises at the worst times. Iron hinges squeaked, wooden beams warped, metal bands rusted. The giant locking bar expanded in the heat and refused to fit in the slot. And every time this happened, a guard shouted, "It's stuck again," in the exact tone of someone who is done with life at 8 a.m. Maintenance workers applied oil to hinges so often that they probably smelled like a medieval hardware store. They sanded wood. They tightened iron bolts. They hammered loose nails without much enthusiasm. And because gates were literal invitations to enemies, everyone pretended these fixes made the castle invincible. Now let's drift back inside the walls, where long, winding staircases curled like stone ribbons. These staircases weren't built for comfort. They were built for defensive advantage, meaning they were narrow, uneven, and functioned as 24-hour tripping hazards. Keeping them safe required endless attention. Loose stones had to be reset, worn edges had to be filed smoother, and every so often, a stair would just give up, a chunk would fall out, someone would sigh deeply. Repairs began again, and because medieval workers had no power tools, which is easy to forget, everything took roughly 3 to 5 times longer than you think. Stone sawing was done with quiet persistence. Chiseling was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. A soft tap, 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 echoing through the stairwell, like a metronome for a very slow ballet. Let's carry that sound with us as we glide deeper into the castle's slower jobs. For example, the drainage system. Not glamorous, not pretty, but absolutely essential if you didn't want puddles forming in the Great Hall every time it rained. Drainage channels along the courtyard had to be cleared of leaves, stones, and the occasional lost object that a child claimed not to have dropped. Servants walked back and forth with brooms and little iron hooks, pulling out debris, muttering at the mud, probably regretting every life decision that brought them here. But the rhythm was calming. Push, scoop, scrape, repeat. Castle maintenance was basically medieval ASMR. And let's not forget the Outer Bailey, where animals, carts, servants, and occasionally confused nobles wandered around. The soil turned to mud. The mud turned to soft clay. The soft clay turned to a chaotic swamp of footprints. Workers spread straw. They leveled ground. They moved stones aside. It was slow and peaceful, until rain came and undid everything, which it absolutely did. Now, drift gently to the rooftops. Medieval roofs were usually tile or slate, arranged like scales on a very patient stone dragon. Tiles cracked. Tiles slipped. Tiles just gave up and fell off during storms, which was why walking near castle walls in high wind was basically medieval roulette. Maintenance crews climbed up there with quiet determination, replacing tiles, checking wooden beams, brushing off debris that blew in from the countryside. Picture it: a cool breeze, a wide sky, a worker sitting quietly on the edge of a tower roof, fixing one tile at a time, humming a little tune under his breath. No urgency, no drama, just slow and steady repair. And below, life continued. Children ran in the courtyard. Guards did their endless, slow-paced patrol. A servant carried water from the well with the resigned grace of someone who had done it 1,000 times, all while the castle itself breathed, in that quiet, living way of structures that have stood for centuries. But even with all this, there were still more calm, slightly tedious aspects of castle maintenance waiting for us. Welcome back, slowly drifting listener. If you're still with me, or half with me, or just vaguely aware that a voice is happening somewhere in the room, that's perfect. We're continuing our peaceful stroll through medieval castle maintenance, the most soothingly uneventful topic human history has ever produced. Let's float now to a place we haven't explored yet: the castle's interior walls. You know, the ones that look strong but somehow always had problems. Medieval interior walls weren't like the outer fortifications. They didn't get dramatic battering from siege engines. They mostly suffered from things like everyday humidity, fires that accidentally got a little too enthusiastic, servants bumping into them with baskets, and nobles knocking into them after one too many cups of whatever counted as wine back then. Over time, plaster cracked, paint peeled, dust settled, and then some poor plasterer had to come along with a bucket of lime and sand, smoothing everything over like a sleepy medieval therapist, patching emotional cracks with mortar. Plaster work was delicate, slow, soft, perfect for curing insomnia. You smear, you pat, you scrape a little edge, you blend it smooth, then wait for it to dry while you stare at it, wondering why walls insist on being so dramatic. Let's drift from the plaster to something even more glamorous: wooden beams. Ah yes, the backbone of the medieval interior. Support beams were made of solid oak, the medieval equivalent of premium construction materials. But even oak had its opinions, and sometimes those opinions included, "I feel like bowing in the middle today," or "I'd like to collect moisture and rot, thanks." Workers constantly checked them, looking for soft spots, tapping them with wooden mallets, running hands over the grain to see if anything felt spongy, which is always a thrilling phrase when you're discussing structural supports. If a beam needed reinforcing, they did it gently, sliding in new wedges, adding braces, tightening iron straps. A slow, steady process, the kind where a worker pauses every few minutes, sighs deeply, and mutters something like, "This beam is older than my grandfather. Why am I negotiating with it?" Now let's wander toward the castle kitchens, which were astonishingly high maintenance. The kitchen was warm, humid, busy, and full of smoke, basically a spa day for structural problems. Walls darkened with soot, ceilings collected smoke stains, roofs needed extra ventilation, and the giant hearth, the real heart of the kitchen, had to be cleaned constantly. Fireplaces in medieval castles were enormous. Like, you could roast an entire goat and still have room for dessert enormous. And with great size came great sweeping. Someone had to clean out ash. Someone had to poke embers. Someone had to scrape soot. And someone, always a different, deeply unlucky someone, had to climb inside the chimney with a brush. Not quickly, not dramatically, just slowly, carefully, with the resigned attitude of a person who knows that tomorrow the chimney will look exactly the same again. Shall we glide away from the warm, smoky kitchen and head outside into the fresh air? Let's drift to the castle gardens. Gardens weren't just pretty. They were practical. Medicinal herbs, vegetables, little orchards tucked against the walls. And of course, nobles wanted their gardens to look pleasant. Not spectacular, just pleasant. So gardeners trimmed hedges at a pace that could lull even the most caffeinated night into a nap. They plucked weeds one by one. They watered plants with quiet patience. They tied little ropes around young trees so they grew straight, because medieval people were very controlling about plant posture. And whenever something died, they simply shrugged, planted another, and continued on their peaceful way. Now let's move to something extremely exciting. Cistern cleaning. Yes, this is what you're listening to at midnight. Your life choices are correct. Castles stored rainwater in big stone tanks called cisterns. Over time, these collected mud, leaves, algae, bugs, mysterious floating objects nobody wanted to touch. So every so often, the cistern was drained, and someone had to climb inside and scoop out the sludge. Not quickly, not vigorously, just slow scooping, gentle scraping. The medieval equivalent of cleaning a fish tank, except the fish tank is the size of a room and smells like medieval disappointment. Let's drift away from that smell and float higher up to the castle battlements, where we left off earlier. Up here, the wind hummed. Birds circled. Guards napped standing up. But behind the peaceful scene, more boring but essential work was always happening. Arrow slits collected dust and needed brushing. Loose stones in the parapet required resetting. And those tiny drains, built to keep rain from pooling on the walkway, clogged constantly. Imagine a worker crouching there, poking at the drain with a stick, waiting for the exact moment the water suddenly released and splashed down the side of the tower in a sad little waterfall. It was, in every sense, the quiet drama of moisture management. Now let's glide into one more maintenance task, one so subtle you probably never thought about it: repairing the mortar joints between stones on high walls. This task was called repointing, and it was basically medieval Zen practice. You chip out old mortar, softly, carefully, trying not to damage the stones. Then you pack in new mortar with deliberate, slow pressure. Smooth the edge. Slide the trowel. Repeat, in silence, except for the occasional bird noise, and maybe a faraway guard coughing in boredom. Repointing took forever, but once it was done, the wall felt refreshed, reset, almost like it had been to a spa and asked for the usual. And the castle slowly, quietly continued to stand, every day, every season, every century, because dozens of tiny, uncelebrated tasks kept it alive, all performed in the soft background of medieval life, where nothing moved too quickly, and nothing stayed fixed for long. If you're still awake, we can drift even deeper into the castle's quiet, dusty corners. The night deepens over the Nile Valley. Stars hang above like quiet guardians, shimmering softly, and the air moves with a cool, gentle breath. You sit near the edge of the river, watching the water glide past. Not rushing, not struggling, just flowing, as if it has all the time in the universe. The moonlight settles on the surface, turning the river into a long ribbon of silver. When the ripples move, they break the light into tiny pieces, little fragments that dance, fade, and return again. Somewhere far across the water, you hear a single sound, a reed bending, a heron shifting its feet. Nothing urgent, just nature settling into place for the night. You rest your hands on the cool sand. It slips between your fingers, soft and ancient. So ancient that these grains were here before empires rose, before temples stood, before anyone carved hieroglyphs into stone. The river speaks in its own quiet language. A slow wave, a whisper against the shore, a soft bubble rising from the deep. It carries stories, stories of travelers, stories of small fishing boats drifting in the early dawn, stories of farmers setting nets in silence, stories of kings crossing to the west for the final time. But tonight, the river tells you only the simplest story, that everything moves, and everything rests, and everything comes back again. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling the rhythm of the Nile, calm, steady, eternal. A warm breeze brushes past your face, carrying the faint scent of lotus petals. They open only at night, their fragrance drifting slowly across the water, like ancient incense offered to the moon. In the distance, the desert cools. The stones of old ruins release the last warmth of the day, and the sky deepens from blue to velvet black. You breathe in, deep, slow, and easy, and as you breathe out, your shoulders soften, your mind quiets, and the world becomes beautifully still. The Nile glides on, never in a hurry, never stopping, just resting in motion, a perfect companion for a perfect, peaceful night. The night settles even deeper now, slow, quiet, gentle, and the air feels cooler against your skin, as if the desert itself is exhaling. You walk slowly toward a small, ancient temple near the river's edge. Not a grand palace, not a place of crowds, just a peaceful stone sanctuary that has watched thousands of nights pass. The temple walls glow faintly under the moonlight. The carvings are worn, softened by time, hieroglyphs smoothed like river stones, but still visible, still whispering their silent stories. You step closer. Your footsteps make almost no sound on the sand. The world feels wrapped in cotton, every noise muted, every movement softened. At the entrance, two small pillars stand quietly. They cast long, gentle shadows that stretch across the ground, like arms guiding you inward. Inside, the air is cooler, still. It feels as if the room has been holding its breath for centuries. Your eyes adjust slowly. You can see faint outlines of old wall paintings, sun discs, lotus flowers, simple scenes of everyday life. Nothing dramatic, just peaceful reminders of people who once lived here, worked here, slept under the same silent sky. A feather drifts down from somewhere high above, light as a sigh. It lands near your foot without a sound. You take a seat on a smooth stone bench. It's cool but comforting, the kind of surface that steadies you, that makes your breathing deepen naturally. Somewhere outside, the Nile continues its slow journey. You hear it faintly through the doorway, a soft trickle, a distant murmur, as if the river is singing a quiet lullaby to the night. In the temple, everything feels paused. Time stretches, slows, lengthens like a shadow at sunset. You run your fingers along the stone beside you. It's textured, old, strong, a reminder that even things shaped thousands of years ago can still bring calm to the present moment. A warm breeze slips through the entrance, carrying the scent of night blossoms. It swirls lightly around you. Not cold, not warm, just gentle enough to remind you that the world outside is still moving, even as your body grows heavier, slower, more relaxed. You close your eyes. In the quiet, your breath becomes the only sound. Deep, slow, steady. The temple holds you gently, like a cradle made of stone and silence. As you drift deeper into the calm of this ancient, peaceful night, the silence inside the small temple settles even further. like a soft blanket lowering itself over the room. Nothing stirs. Nothing rushes. Everything is gentle and unhurried, as if the night itself is practicing slow breathing. After a few moments, you hear the faintest brush of sandals on stone. A quiet, careful sound, like someone trying not to disturb a dream. A night priest enters. Not a grand figure. Not someone draped in gold or heavy linen. Just an older man with calm, steady eyes. And a simple robe that moves like slow water when he walks. He doesn't seem surprised to find you there. And why would he be? It's the kind of night where all things feel allowed. Even wandering into an ancient sanctuary, just to breathe and rest. He gives you a nod. Soft, almost sleepy himself. Then he continues with his quiet routine. He lights a small oil lamp near the wall. The flame is tiny, barely more than a warm glow, but it fills the room with a new softness, a golden tint that blends beautifully. With the pale moonlight spilling through the doorway, the flame flickers once, then settles into a gentle sway. Slow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat made of light. The priest checks a few small offerings. Simple clay bowls of water, some dried herbs, a faded lotus resting in a dish. Nothing grand, nothing ceremonious, just the quiet upkeep of a place meant for peace. He moves from one bowl to the next, his steps nearly silent, his breath steady and unhurried. Everything he touches is done with care, not because it's sacred, but because the night seems to ask for gentleness. You watch him for a moment. He doesn't speak. He doesn't chant. He simply tends to the space, one tiny gesture at a time, as if tending to a sleeping world. When he finishes, he glances at you again with a soft, understanding expression. Not intrusive, not curious, just acknowledging that you, too, are part of the stillness tonight. He quietly sits at a low stool near a statue tucked in the corner. The statue is small, worn smooth with age, its features softened into simple shapes that radiate calm. The priest rests his hands on his knees, his posture relaxed, his eyes half closed, like someone who is letting the night pass through him, rather than staying awake to fight it. Outside, a tiny shift in the wind sighs through the doorway, sending a ripple through the flame. That dances once, then returns to stillness. The temple feels warm now, not from heat, but from presence, from the quiet companionship of a human echo in an ancient place. You sit there together in silence, two figures sharing the same gentle pocket of the night, the same soft air, the same drifting thoughts that float as slowly as the Nile outside. And for a moment, everything feels perfectly aligned. The stone, the flame, the river, the priest, the quiet inside your chest. The night continues, but it asks for nothing. It simply is. And you are here, resting inside it. The air inside the temple grows even quieter, so still that you begin to notice the subtle sounds around you, little things that normally disappear into the background of a busy day. A faint rumble of wind brushing along the outer stones, a gentle creak of old wood somewhere high above, and beneath it all, the soft, steady murmur of the Nile. It calls to you in its quiet way, not urgently, just a gentle reminder that the river is always there, flowing through every moment, as patient as time itself. You rise slowly from a stone bench, your movements unhurried, as if your limbs have learned the peaceful pace of the night. The night priest watches you go with a small nod. No words, just a silent farewell, from one dreamer to another. Stepping back outside, the air wraps around you with a soft, cool embrace. The moon hangs higher now, its reflection shimmering on the water, like a long, wavering ribbon of silver. You walk toward the riverbank, at a slow, easy pace, each step sinking slightly into the soft sand, each footprint fading gently behind you. The Nile's sound grows clearer, a smooth, endless whisper. Not rushing, not forceful, just calm, gliding water, moving with purpose. But no hurry. You settle near the bank, where the ground dips gently downward, and sit on a smooth, worn stone that feels pleasantly cool beneath you. The river stretches out in front of you, broad and quiet, with the faint outlines of palm trees swaying lightly in the distance. Their shadows blend together, soft and wavering, like dark brushstrokes on a silver canvas. A small boat drifts far across the water, nothing more than a silhouette. The oars dip into the Nile so quietly that the sound feels like part of the wind. Someone is guiding it across the river, probably heading home, probably humming a small tune. Only they can hear. The boat barely leaves a ripple. It glides, smooth and silent, as if the river itself is carrying it. You breathe in slowly. The scent of water plants, of cool stone, of night blossoms opening in the dark. Everything around you moves in subtle rhythms. The soft lap of water against the shore, the occasional plunk of a fish surfacing then vanishing, the gentle rustle of leaves shifting in the breeze. It feels like the Nile is alive, but in a quiet, sleepy way, like a giant lying down under the moon, breathing steadily. You watch the surface of the water as tiny ripples drift outward from nothing in particular, little circles expanding, softening, fading. Your mind begins to drift with them, floating outward, slowing down, loosening its grip on thoughts that belong to the day. A warm breeze brushes your cheek, a slow, gentle pass, like a hand smoothing your hair. Somewhere behind you, a desert owl lets out a calm, low call, not eerie, just soft and distant, like a sound that has already begun to fade. The river continues its lullaby, steady and comforting. You could listen to it for hours and never grow tired. It's the kind of sound that settles into the spaces inside you and makes everything quieter. The moon shifts slightly in the sky, sending a fresh shimmer across the water, a long, glowing path that seems to point toward nowhere in particular, which somehow makes it even more peaceful. You sit there, breathing with the river, feeling the night stretch out around you, like a soft, endless blanket. Everything is calm. Everything is slow. Everything is enough.